We met on the DAMA International Board. It was fantastic to work with Daragh. We met him in Ireland, so it was really good fun. Veronica and I were there, and we had a lovely time with the Irish. Unfortunately, they beat us really badly in the rugby, but we lived up. We managed to get past that and continue. So the two things I wanted to ask. The first one was, would you like us to keep our questions until the end of the meeting, or can they interrupt? And I'm willing to handle the chat, and then I'll ask when appropriate, or we can leave them to the end.
I think we'll leave questions to the end,
Okay.
because maybe the answer is 3 slides in the future, and
Right.
we'll see what happens.
Okay. And then the last question was, when we give away these books, and we'd really like to sponsor giving away one of your books to the people on the chat, and to make a decision about who we like to see, which question or which observation either challenged you the most or struck you as the most insightful, and would it be okay for us to ask you at the end as to who that or what the question was, or how would you like to?
I like this, Art. The biggest pain in the neck gets the book. That's brilliant. That's a very, very clever model. No, it's a perfect way. I have no problem admitting who stumped me when they asked me a
Okay,
question. And
fantastic.
it'll be my pleasure.
Okay, great. So with that, we'll hand over to yourself, Daragh. We look forward to hearing again. I must admit, I read your first book, the E2IM, and it was great for me. It was probably my first book of ethics, and I'm not sure if you remember, I was part of the ethics team in DAMI International, and the amount of learning that I had to do just to understand what it was all about was tremendous. I didn't think that I was so far off and lacked that fundamental understanding of ethics. So it was a great book. I really enjoyed it. Lots of people felt it was very intense, or there was lots of information, but I really liked it. And thank you for your first book. Look forward to your
Thanks, Howard.
second book.
Thanks, Howard. So we have the difficult second child. Howard's referencing the books there. So to show the slide, there's the first two, Ethical Data Information Management, and then the second edition, Data Ethics. What changed between 2018 and 2023, 2024 was that the publisher realized that stuffing book titles full of keywords wasn't really helping their online marketing strategy. So we were able to have the original shorter title that we'd wanted, Data Ethics. So brief copyright notice here. We're using some content from both books in the course of the presentation. The materials from the books are copyright myself and my colleague, Dr. Catherine O'Keefe. And the content of this presentation is copyright of Castlebridge, my company. So a little bit about me. Founder, managing director of Castlebridge, fellow of the Irish Computer Society. I'm a contributor to the IVI, the Innovation Value Institute in NUI Maynooth, and I'm actually in the process of just starting a doctoral program researching data governance. So kind of busy. I've done some things with the DIMBOK and a few other things over the years, and I've been on the DAMA International Board and the DAMA Ireland Board and a few other boards over the years. The way I summarize myself, though, is I'm just a boy looking at organizations and their data for over 25 years and wondering. So, to start, I just want to tell you all a story of someone who I think every data management professional needs to know about. And this is just one person. There's probably hundreds of people like this person. But the key person I'd like to talk about is a guy called René Carmille. René Carmille was a French artillery officer who went on to become a statistician and was the lead statistician in the French civil service at the turn of the century. So the early 20th century, the beginnings of the implementation of data management practices and data tabulation practices in public sector organizations across the world. So one of the things René Carmille did was introduce punch card tabulation machines into the French public service, to the French civil service, for the purposes of gathering and tabulating statistical information. And that was fantastic. He was an artillery officer, statistician, early adopter of computing. So a lot of what we're looking at today in terms of digital transformation in organizations, digital transformation in public sector, the great grandfather of all of those initiatives is René Carmille. However, in the 1930s, the French government wanted to run a census. And one of the questions they wanted to ask in the census was about the religion of people. And René Carmille, as the chief statistician for the French government, said no. The French state was a secular state. The government didn't need to know about the religion of the citizens in order to count them and know where they were and know how many of them there were and what ages they were and what their needs were. So he refused to include that question in the census. Later on, after the invasion of France, the Vichy government wanted to run a census of business ownership, and they asked the question about the religion of the owners of the business. René Carmille wasn't in a position to stop that question being asked. The nature of government had changed. His bosses were a little bit less willing to accept his arguments. So what he did was he instructed his team to sabotage pin number 13 on the card readers, which meant that the data was not read. He also introduced very, very detailed data governance procedures for any requests for data or any requests for reports, looking for detailed file specifications, detailed report specifications, and a number of different layers of sign-off. So if you think your data governance processes might be bureaucratic, René Carmille weaponized his because he realized that if that data was captured or processed or used, bad things might happen. So while he didn't prevent the bad things from happening, he at the very least helped slow them down. But because he was a statistician, because the register of births, marriages, and deaths for the French government fell under his purview, he kept a lot of dead people alive, so their identities could be used by resistance fighters, by Allied personnel, Allied soldiers or airmen who were shot down over France, and refugees. He gave people identities so they could move safely. René Carmille died in Dachau concentration camp on the 25th of January 1945, a few weeks before Dachau was liberated. But René Carmille understood the power and the value of data and the fact that data affects people. It doesn't necessarily have to relate directly to people or directly identify people. But all the data we're capturing and gathering and processing, we're doing because we're trying to do something for people. John Ladley describes data as a 24/7 recording of human existence. I think it's a really profound way of describing it. When we're thinking about our role as data management professionals from an ethics perspective, we need to think beyond the high concept that everyone's talking about. And we need to think about what can we do in our day-to-day roles to either prevent bad things from happening, but at least get people to think and talk about the issues and risks that might arise with the adoption of data management technologies or the implementation of data processes. So that's René Carmille. The challenge we have is principles. Groucho Marx. I love Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx famously said, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I can get others." And this is one of the challenges we have. What are our principles? Well, part of the confusion around principles is we have this explosion of discussion about ethics. We have AI ethics, we have data ethics, we have digital ethics, we have business ethics, we have professional ethics, we have computer ethics. It's all very confusing. Which of these ethics do we pick? Well, let's start by saying what we're dealing with is ethics, and then we are applying ethics in a context. So when we're dealing with our ethical questions down here, it might be a professional ethics question, do I, as a professional data management professional, have an ethical obligation to, for example, give an objective assessment about the benefits or weaknesses of a proposed technology? From a business ethics perspective, we might have to ask the question, is it ethical for us to gather up all this customer data and use it for a new purpose? It might be something that's very good for the business, but it mightn't be ethical to do it. Is it ethical for us to, I don't know, hack into one of our competitors' CRM systems and steal all their customer data? Now, it's illegal. Is it unethical? Probably. Don't do it. And then we have the specifics of data ethics. When we look at the day-to-day nitty-gritty of data, we have computer ethics. Well, that's basically data ethics. We have AI ethics. Well, that's basically computer ethics and data ethics. And digital ethics. Digital ethics, I think, is the ethics of doing things with your fingers. Or it's how we use digital technologies to support the use of data through the use of computers and automation to do things. But ultimately, we need to step back from the bubble and the silo and remember that we're talking about principles for how we as people should interact with and consider the needs and interests of other people. And that's at the heart of this. This is a people thing. It's an anthropological thing as well as an ethical thing. So the Mercoulis Center for Applied Ethics in Stanford University defines ethics as standards and practices that tell us how human beings ought to act in the many situations in which they find themselves as parents, friends, citizens, business people, professionals, and so on. It's concerned with our character, not the character of our organization, but us as individuals. But when you get a lot of people together working in an organization, that can become the ethic of the group can become the ethic of the organization. Things it's not. This annoys me when I hear people saying, I feel this is bad. Well, great. Let's put some structure around that. Let's unpick why you feel it's bad. What is the ethical principle you have? What's the value you have that is being offended or infringed upon by the proposed course of action? Sometimes ethics is confused with religion or philosophical beliefs. And yes, religion and philosophy does impact on ethics, but atheists have ethics too. Doesn't necessarily have to be derived from a particular religion. And it's not the same as just doing what the law requires. Law, legislation, regulation tends to be the lagging indicator of the ethic of society, as we describe it in the book. It is the thing where we have legislated to say these are the minimum standards for conduct we expect people to have in this society. And also, it's not just culturally accepted norms. 200 years ago, it was perfectly acceptable in the United Kingdom and Ireland to put small children up chimneys, to clean the chimneys. It was entirely optional whether you didn't have a fire lighting in the fireplace at the time. It wasn't until 1865 that we had the concept of primary education for children working in factories. They were culturally accepted things. There was no law against them. But we had to change in that context. And just because we can doesn't mean we should. Classic good example in the media today. OpenAI apparently using Scarlett Johansson's voice for their AI system without her permission, which is bad enough if they hadn't asked for her permission and she said no, but they went ahead and did it anyway, using a voice that sounded very like hers. So just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should, which means we need to think about how we apply ethical principles in that context. Now, a lot of what we see written about data ethics is very biased towards what I call dead white guy philosophy. Western European classical Greek philosophy, deontology, Immanuel Kant, utilitarianism and consequentialism, Aristotle's virtue-based ethics, the feminist approach of ethics of care, where we're looking at balancing competing rights and interests and things like that. But there's also non-Western ethical frames. But this is where this brings me back to what I said earlier on about it's not just about a culture, and it's not just about a religion or a set of philosophical beliefs. Because there's lots of different schools and approaches to how we think about ethics. One of my colleagues, Blessing Maturo, is Zimbabwean. He's doing his PhD thesis in Trinity College Dublin on what European data protection law can learn from the philosophy and cultural norms of Ubuntu as expressed in African data protection law. And it's a fascinating thesis with different perspective, different ethical perspective on the same questions, on the same issues. And this is why at an online conference a couple of years ago, there was a question posed in discussion, can we not just get to a single universal ethical rule? And my answer was, we've been trying to do that for 4,500 years. If you can crack that algorithm, fantastic. But we just need to accept that there is no one-size-fits-all ethic. There are, however, in all of these different domains and different cultural views, when we lay them side by side or on top of each other, we can begin to see some commonalities between them. But there are also important differences. So the challenge we have is to take episteme, which is a fancy Greek word for theoretical principles and thinking and talking about things, and translate that into phronesis, the actual doing of the things, turning this into actionable practices in organizations. And that doing of things should, in theory, inform our theoretical principles, so we're evolving our understanding of ethics as they apply to data in our organization, in our society. And that's the challenge, because we have an awful lot, and I'll talk in a few minutes about how much we have up here in terms of episteme. The challenge is this phronesis. I'm going to talk a little bit about an approach to where we might see the tools for making that bridge happen. Now, this image was generated using AI. And I only realized recently that there's actually a perfectly good illustration of the problem in this image, because the image spelled episteme right, and that's supposed to be Plato sitting at a computer figuring out what tools he'll use. But if you notice down here, the word phronesis is spelt wrong. The technology could not put the thing into practice. We could not get the phronesis right just using technology. And that's a really, really interesting visual metaphor that happened almost by accident. The AI could not get the spelling right. Now, another example of definition of data ethics, Harvard Business School talked about data ethics as encompassing moral obligations of protecting and using personally identifiable information and how it affects individuals. This is a shit definition, pardon my language. It's a really, really bad definition because it focuses our attention just on one subset of all the data we have. Not all data that raises ethical questions is going to relate directly to people. If I have data about the water supply to a location, or I have data about the rate of melt of an ice cap, that is data that will affect people. And therefore, there are ethical obligations on me to make sure I'm handling that data in a particular way, that I'm ensuring the quality of that data, that I'm ensuring the accessibility of that data, things like that. It doesn't identify people, but if we don't know that the data is telling us something is coming, we don't know the information in question, well, then we might make imprecise decisions about things that will affect people in society. So, ethical data management is defined by myself and Catherine in the book as a branch of ethics that evaluates our data practices that have the potential to adversely impact on people and society, whether through their collection, sharing, or use. So all we're looking at here from a broad perspective is the ethical concepts we're going to apply to the data we're processing and using when we think about how that data is going to affect people or society at different levels. As I said, this is a key principle to take away from today. Not all data that is personal or that relates to people identifies an identifiable person, but all data has the impact to inform decisions or actions that can impact on individuals. Ultimately, the key question is, if you have data that isn't going to have an impact, that isn't going to result in some decision being taken that will cause a thing to occur or not occur, or a thing to exist or not exist, why are you capturing that data in the first place? One of the oldest written records we have is a letter of complaint about the quality of delivered copper and the attitude of the merchant to the purchaser's slave when he went to collect the copper. That's information that's recorded that has an impact on people. It's a recording an event. So we need to be thinking about how our data records events and records human existence and the interaction of humans with other humans and with the environment as a whole. So here's an example of a real-world application of this. In the Netherlands a couple of years ago, the Dutch government introduced an AI system for managing their social welfare system and taxation system, looking for fraud. It generated risk indicators based on AI, but because of biases in the data, because of assumptions made in the development of business rules, families received tax demands that they didn't actually owe, which pushed them into poverty. Some people committed suicide, 1,000 children were taken into care, and the Dutch government was fined 3.7 million euros for multiple violations of EU data protection law for not having a legal basis for using AI. But there was a larger ethical question about whether they should have been using unproven technologies in this way to infer things. And when we look at in the UK, we have the post office scandal at the moment. Similar issues arise in terms of the ethics of decision making and the blind belief in the infallibility of a system in the face of evidence that the system was the problem. And instead, they prosecuted innocent postmasters. So ethical questions arise there in terms of how we conduct ourselves. And this brings us to what we call the ethical onion. So in the book, the two books, we describe this concept of the ethic of the individual. And then we don't explicitly refer to it in the book in the first edition. We do mention in the second edition the ethic of the team or tribe. So everyone knows that IT and marketing don't get on, but everyone agrees that HR are the real enemy. They're the tribes in the organization. And the ethic and the values of the organization express themselves in that way. And then you have the ethic of the organization's culture, how the organization thinks about itself, its mission, its values, its goals. These are elements of the ethic of the organization. And then we have on the outside the ethic of society. What does society think about these things? What does society value? What do the individuals who make up society value and express as their key ethical principles and ethical values? And one of the key elements of that is the ethic of society changes. As people become aware of issues and risks with the way information is handled and managed, they may become skeptical or resist things that they had previously accepted. Or society may be resisting something that when they become more aware of the benefits and safeguards, etc., they become more accepting of. And we call it an ethical onion because as you peel away the layers, you begin to cry more and more. As you get down into figuring out how to balance these different competing interests, it becomes a challenge. So, how do we bridge the gap between episteme and phronesis? Well, episteme is our principles, phronesis is our practice, and the ladder that links them all is what the Greeks called technique or craft. So, what is our craft as data management professionals? And this is stuff that actually isn't in the book, Howard. This is new stuff, building from the book. Yeah. But I'm going to come to the next bit. You're going to see a bit that's really familiar. Because our craft is defined in the DIMBOK. The things we can use to take high-level principles, and there are about 140 to 200 frameworks for AI ethics alone currently published, none of which translate into actionable, executable principles. The techni layer is our DIMBOK disciplines. So for example, if I am developing a new system, do I take the time to develop a data model? to help inform the efficiency of queries. If I know that shaving 2 or 3 seconds off the processing time for a query is going to reduce energy consumption for my organization by a certain amount. There's an ethical question there where, okay, it's only a small bit of query optimization, but it's a thing we can do. In the same way as René Carmille's staff knew that if they broke pin 13 on that punch card reader, they would prevent the recording of data in a particular way. So the DIMBOK is a useful way of identifying the craft we are executing as data management professionals. That's ultimately what it is. It's the description of our professional discipline. And when we look at ethics through the DIMBOK lens, we can say, well, data modeling, energy efficiency, data quality. If we have defective data, if people are having to rerun queries or validate and check data and do multiple processing activities, that's a cost to the business, but it may also have an environmental impact as well. And so on. You might look at what bias issues are introduced into AI models or other systems through data quality issues. How are we encoding ethical values in our metadata? For example, until July of 2022, you couldn't register for a British Airways flight online if you were female and you were a doctor. British Airways did not allow females to select doctor from the drop-down list for title. And that was a value encoded in metadata. Whether they meant that value or not doesn't matter. There was an ethical value encoded in metadata, which was, just sit down there now and relax. You'll be grand. Don't worry your little head. All the boy doctors, they'll take care of everyone. Another critical one is documented content management. Yes, SharePoint's boring. SharePoint's a pain in the neck. No one likes SharePoint. But documented content management represents potentially historical archival value for the organization and potentially archival value for society, particularly for a government organization and even obligation towards National Archives legislation. These are things that have ethical impacts, and these are our data management disciplines. How do we implement these things? From a governance perspective, these are things we can do through our craft that have ethical impacts and implications. Of course, we can't separate data ethics from data governance. And this is a model from the book based on work by a woman called Linda Trevino in the 1980s on business ethics, where she looked at the idea of an ethical decision that has, or an action that has to be made. And the influences include the ethic of the individual, which is the individual's cognitive moral development, as Trevino called it. We call it the ethic of the individual. What values do you as an individual bring into your organization? What perspective do you bring to the choices and decisions you're making, whether you're a data modeler, a data governance professional, a metadata manager, a master data manager? Your perspectives on why this stuff is important. And the old joke, what's the difference between a terrorist and a data modeler? You can negotiate with a terrorist. These perspectives come to bear in that regard. What we're ultimately looking at is our outcomes about process and information. So what are the outcomes we're delivering to society, to our stakeholders, and how society views those outcomes determines whether we're doing something ethically or not. And within the organization, then, our organizational culture and governance is the thing that one of the key moderators of the behavior of the individual, the rules we have in the organization for how we do things. Just as René Carmille introduced data governance controls into the French statistical system to slow down the occupying force. And notice I'm being really, really careful to be diplomatic and not name the occupying force. But we all know who they were. But that cultural piece, the organizational controls, the governance, and we can't ignore then the effect of the ego of the individual. Are they someone who's going to pick a fight to stand up for what they believe in? And do they have any support? Because one person fighting against the tide is one thing, people with support is another. But what we've seen in organizations is even where there has been a mass movement, so we've seen mass walkouts in Microsoft and Google and other organizations over the years, the organization tends to win if the culture of the organization isn't going to move. Unless the organization is going to evolve its culture and values, the organization will correct for the error, which is the individual in that context. So we really can't differentiate or break these things out. If you want to do ethical data management, it does mean having to look at the governance structures of the organization and the values of the organization and what you are rewarding and incentivizing in the organization. Otherwise, it's just wallpaper. It doesn't matter. To do ethics, you have to change. An example of where this has happened is Hollywood writers went on strike last year, and they eventually reached an agreement about guardrails on AI in their industry. They stood up and said, no, we are as a group are withdrawing our labor until there are safeguards put in place around the ethical decisions around using artificial intelligence to write scripts and do things like that. And they won. They got a deal. Principles are really important. Cascading principles, again, this is from the first edition, this is from the second edition. Our principles cascade down to outcomes through our policies, our procedures, our processes, and that's all held together and aligned through our governance structures in the organization. But our principles don't just appear out of thin air. We need to have a clear statement of what the principle is and why it matters. We need to have a rationale for that principle. And we have to be able to articulate the benefits to the organization or to society or to our stakeholders of those principles, and then the implications of following those principles or not following those principles. So if we have an ethical principle of we are an organization that is aiming for net zero carbon by 2030, that's great. That's our high level principle. The rationale, well, the rationale speaks for itself. The benefits speak for themselves, but the implication is maybe anything we can do to reduce energy consumption in any area of the organization must be done, which means optimization of queries suddenly becomes not a boring thing your DBA is concerned about, but a really interesting part of your environmental social governance obligations that your CEO cares about. Because if you're running lots of queries and you're shaving 2 seconds off those queries and you're running 3,000 of those queries an hour, that's 6,000 seconds saved every hour. And that's more seconds than there are in an hour. That adds up. But that's because you've got lots of queries running in parallel. But that then turns into potential money saving and energy saving in the organization. So Algorithm Watch published 160 AI ethics frameworks. This is research that was published in 2022. About 5% of them represent a form of binding agreement. Less than 10% are voluntary commitment, and the rest are all recommendations. They are very much at the episteme level. We suggest you should do these things. So what we need to do as professionals is to take those recommendations, run them through the filter of the DIMBOK, and figure out what does that mean for us on a day-to-day basis in our little bit of the world that we're managing. Because we can't fix everything. We can only fix the bits that are in front of us. We can look for our principles for our organizations and ourselves in our published ethics frameworks, those 160 things I talked about. We can look at industry standards. We can look at the organization standards. What does your organization say its values are? What I will also say is, show me what they pay for, and I'll tell you what their values actually are, but that's another story. Legislation, we can get values from that. Your own personal individual moral code. What's your sense of right and wrong? But professional codes of ethics are a really useful source as well. Lots of different places we can find principles in. We just need to distill them down into things that are actionable. Professional bodies and associations like DAMA and DAMA South Africa have a really important role to play here because they give a mechanism for individuals to be supported. It's not just one person saying a thing about the ethical issues in data. If DAMA South Africa is saying, this is actually a way in which data management can help with these important things. And these are important principles we're going to apply as a profession to how we can use our tools and our skills to improve things, or at the very least, try and stop things getting worse. A professional body allows us to put collective pressure on organizations. We create a critical mass. It's not just one person raising the issue and concern. And also, we can help develop the ethic of the individual by having education, by having training. All of you here today have now learned something about ethics that you didn't know an hour ago. And if you buy the book, you learn an awful lot more. I'm very much a shareholder value theory ethicist in that regard. We can influence the ethics of society if professional bodies take a stand or communicate into society about things, even writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper as the representative of your local Davis South Africa subchapter. Fantastic. These are all things you can do. Now, I'll highlight here the ACM Code of Ethics because it has some interesting elements to it. And one of the key ethical requirements, if you remember of the ACM, for example, is to give comprehensive and thorough evaluations of computer systems and their impacts, including analysis of possible risks. That's a really fundamental ethical principle for members of the American Association of Computing Machinery.
Yeah.
You are ethically required to speak truth to power and to call bullshit on shiny technology. And to point out that, yes, if you want to run a large language model on the unstructured data in an organization, that's great, but you have to make sure we're controlling and governing that unstructured data properly to mitigate the risks of unintended disclosures of data. And maybe that large language model is actually in an inefficient way of solving the problem we're trying to solve. And maybe there's a better way by doing, I don't know, data modeling, document and content management, and a bit of metadata management. All these good things that are unsexy, unglamorous, but very, very important. Now, I won't mention the detail that the DAMA Code of Ethics goes into on these sorts of issues. We'll skip over that. Well, this is a concern. One of the things we need to be wary of at the moment is we're in an interesting time where technology is changing and evolving. Just like at the turn of the 20th century, René Carmille was looking at the wonders of tabulation systems. He realized the ability to gather lots of data quickly and produce analysis quickly could result in bad things happening faster. At an event in Ireland in March, John Ladley came out with this statement. Within the next 5 years, there'll be no data modeling jobs as we understand them today. Because large language models today can do a reasonably good job of identifying and defining entities and relationships for common things. Because we have 20 or 30 years of people publishing papers on universal data models. They may have ingested Len Silverstone's books into the OpenAI data set, in which case they've got the universal data models. Who knows? Our data storage and processing contributes more to greenhouse gas emissions than automotive and airline industries combined, and it is growing. So the inefficiencies we have accepted in our operation of systems, the data quality problems we have, the data modeling issues we might have, the efficiency of queries issues we may have, the redundancy of data issues we may have, the massive abundance of redundant data we might have in organizations. These are all challenging problems that have a potential impact on our environmental footprint as a profession. So digitaldecarb.org, it's the University of Loughborough in the United Kingdom. They've got a fantastic research group there looking at exactly this. And their data is shocking in a good way, but also in a bad way. So we're beginning to see in Ireland, we're beginning to see this trickling through other professional bodies. Trade unions are now asking questions about artificial intelligence. Just this week, our public sector workers union, the largest union in the state.
Okay. I'm looking.
They had 14 motions at their annual conference about the use of AI. Our financial services union, which includes tech sector workers, also has a number of motions at their annual conference.
Are you on mute?
I'm back now.
Yep, you're back.
So the financial services union has a number of motions on artificial intelligence and workplace surveillance. And just this morning, Microsoft have launched Microsoft Recall as part of Copilot, which takes screenshots of what you have on your desktop. General advice to everybody, do not turn that on. Please try and get that turned off if you find that your organization has turned it on. It is not well thought through as a solution. But anyway, that's an argument from the day. So key takeaways for today. Our processing of data has to serve humanity, has to serve people. At the moment, we have sometimes veer into the world of the processing of technology of data is going to happen, and the people are just on the periphery, and we might get some benefit out of it later. There's a lot of bullshit and hand waving about data ethics. There's a lot of useful but informative but ultimately useless principles and frameworks. The challenge is turning that into actionable things that we can do in our professional practice. So our episteme into phronesis. Our technology, our techne, as the Greeks put it, is the Dinbok, is our professional disciplines, our craft as data management professionals. And I would argue that we are ethically obliged to be objective in our assessment of technologies and benefit and their risks and benefits, and to, in the context of the role we have, the skills we have, to try and use those skills in the best way to improve how data can serve humans. After all, data people are people too. We're making choices about automating tasks and functions we have performed in the past. We have to remember that there are going to be second order effects from that. The way I became a data modeler was by doing really bad data models and having people telling me they were wrong and explaining why they were wrong. The way I became a project manager was doing project work breakdown schedules and realizing how they didn't work and the assumptions I'd overlooked. That grunt work that we can now ask a large language model to do for us means we could have a generation of people coming to the workforce who don't understand the fundamental principles of some of the things we are trying to do, and therefore won't be able to understand what good output looks like out of these technologies, which means the technique, the skills, and the disciplines become even more important so that we can understand how the technology is actually working in practice. And at the end of the day, when faced with a choice, it's worth asking yourself, what would René Carmille do? WW or CD? Okay, that's my dog and pony show. Any questions?
Thanks, Kara. I mean, that was Carolyn put up her hand. Thanks, Daragh, for that. We have quite a few questions that are in the chat. Let me start reading them out. And the first thing I found very interesting was that we had someone called Costa Iotis who actually used Ubuntu in ethical papers that he published. So that was about 3-4 years ago. So that's quite interesting. I think he used some of the Dame Emir platforms as well. So nice to see people taking that a level further.
Yeah, and what I like is Blessing's explanation of when Blessing gets, my Zimbabwean colleague gets somewhat frustrated when he sees people who don't really understand Ubuntu referring to Ubuntu.
Yes.
It's like saying you're applying Christianity as your ethical framework. There's lots of different flavors.
Yeah.
And that's something that it's been an interesting journey for me learning that. And I think that's one of the key things we're looking at ethics. It's about being aware of and being willing to learn that there are these different perspectives.
Fantastic. Okay, so Kyla asks the question, do you think ethics is directly related to our level of knowledge, discovery, education regarding the example of children's being used in chimneys? Surely this is a continually evolving field, and the key is never to think we have arrived.
Yes, it is absolutely an area of continuous improvement. The day we think we've got it right, something horrible will happen the next day. And this, where in the second edition of the book, the closing chapter, I talk about one of the key things we need to do to improve the data ethical literacy in society. Part of that is to educate people on how data actually works, how these systems actually work. What is OpenAI? What is a large language model? How does ChatGPT work? ChatGPT is a glorified random number generator.
Yeah. But it does it
That's
very well
all
in
it
some
does.
cases.
It does it very fancily. There's lots of nice bits around it, and it ingests lots of data. But ultimately, it is a predictive algorithm that picks the next best, the next most likely character in a string of text, and because of the law of large numbers, that looks like an intelligent output some of the time. But these are the sorts of things that we need to educate people on. My daughter's school, she's in high school, they're using SharePoint. but they haven't been taught about file planning or data classification or metadata or any of these things, at least not officially. But it's interesting the number of teenage girls who seem to want to know about these things so they understand how the technology works. And I think
Yeah.
that's great. The curiosity of children is brilliant.
Fantastic. And then I had a question when you spoke about applying our craft in terms of professionals. Now, we know, for example, that civil engineers can get into trouble if they don't do don't do it correctly. Is that sort of where we're going with this? And is that the level that we should be trying to achieve in this professional misconduct? Because if you're not thinking about it and you're not applying it, then you're really not doing your job properly.
This question came up when I did a version of this presentation for DAMA Calgary at DAMA Canada's DAMA Days back
Yeah,
in November. And you're absolutely right. What we have here is in the engineering professions, they sign off on the designs, and there is potential personal liability if the design was done negligently.
yeah,
And that means the abstract risk. I do you sat in on some of the sessions I've done on the neuropsychology of risk, Howard.
yeah, yeah.
Unless the risk is personalized, we don't take it seriously. So engineers signing off on design blueprints, they take it seriously. A friend of mine from high school, so a friend of mine from university he did engineering, he went on to design roller coasters for a very large mouse-based entertainment group. And that organization, the roller coaster design teams, the first people to ride the roller coaster, the engineer who designed it,
Right.
the lawyer who signed off on it, and the park manager. So everyone has skin in the game that it works and it is safe because they're the first people to ride it.
Fantastic.
And I think as a profession, maybe we need to have some skin in the game. At the moment, we don't.
Right. The next question from Percy is, can sacrificing individual benefits for the greater good of society be justified ethically?
Well, anyone who's watched Star Trek will tell you yes. The needs of the many can sometimes outweigh the needs of the few, but sometimes the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many. And this is where we have that balancing act between competing interests, which is where we look at deontological ethics or ethics of care, or we get to Ubuntu, which is all about that group right,
Yeah.
those group rights versus individual rights. Well, it's not all about that, but that's the bit I'm picking on for to answer this question. And it is a thing where we would look at that part of and articulating the balancing of that, because there will be people who say, oh, that's not the way to do it. The challenge in those situations is to be able to articulate why that approach is being taken and why you're adopting that particular weighting of competing rights and interests. But we do this all the time. It's called democracy. We vote in
Yeah.
an election, and then whoever gets the most votes wins. The group dictates in many cases. So it's always going to be a trade-off. And this is where the rabid individualistic view that we see in some countries, cultures, and I'm not pointing to any country at all, certainly not one beginning with U, ending in A with an S in the middle. That can be problematic, but if we at least get to a point of recognizing that there is always going to be a trade-off between the individual and society. That's unfortunately what happens when we stop being individual wandering nomads and we start settling down and have farms and sheep and crops and things. We start having to have these norms and trade-offs between the individual and the group. From a data perspective, we're just doing that at a different level. And ironically, there's going to be a really good PhD thesis on exactly that topic coming out next year from my colleague Blessing Maturo. That's exactly what his PhD thesis is on.
Oh, fantastic. We'll look forward to that. Another question was, I know in corporate governance or King 4, they instituted a dual board system that had oversight of decisions made by management decisions in terms of now this was partly whistleblowing that had the path up there. Is that not a similar place where ethics should be validated as well?
ethics should be embedded into the organization as part of the culture. If you're looking at the oversight, then we're looking at having a clear oversight function. So in European data protection law, you get the idea of the data protection officer. That's an oversight function, not an executive function. And the role of the data protection officer is to look at how are we applying data protection legislation, but part of that is that balancing act of the interests of the organization against the interests of the individual. And yes, it comes down in an organizational design context to how we pick that out. And in the book, we do include a suggested model for a data ethics forum structure that came out of work we did with Nordic Telecoms company in 2013, 2014, very early on. But they created a data ethics review board that sat in parallel to the data governance function, but it was informing and advising the data governance function. And it's all about organizational design at the end of the day. If you have a 5-person company, that isn't going to work because the person who is the data governance board is also the data ethics board and also runs payroll on a Friday. And this is the challenge that we have in implementation is we often find organizations taking off-the-shelf models and trying to make them work because McKinsey or Gartner says this is the way you do it. But there's only 3 of you, and there's not enough baseball hats to go around.
Sure. Praveen asked the question, data scientists yield tremendous power. What should an industry do to uphold the integrity and are deemed to be always well intended? Historically, the compromises were exposed in the auditing and legal professions, and yet they still yield this unfettered power. How can the industry begin to protect itself?
Okay, so how can we as an industry begin to protect ourselves? The first thing I say is data scientists need to recognize that the science part of the term data scientist is very important. As part of my doctoral program, I'm going through the process of being trained on scientific method again, and the scientific ethics and research ethics. If you want to be a scientist, that comes with some baggage. If you want to just run statistics, that's different. Part of what we need to do is actually up our game as a profession. There will always be individuals who act unethically in any profession, whether a legal professional, accounting profession. There will always be companies that act unethically. And in fact, in a lot of cases, it's not even the companies acted unethically, it's that lots of people in companies acted unethically and it dragged the company with it. Except for Enron, that was a total car crash. Ironically, a data quality problem. If they kept an eye on the spreadsheets, it wouldn't have been a problem. But they had a trigger where the percentage shareholding went over 14.9% in one company, and that triggered an automatic notification. But the key thing here is we deal with this by recognizing it's a thing that can happen, that bad things can happen. We recognize that other professions have had bad things happen, and we do what we do as data people. Look for the patterns. Look for the things and behaviors that cause those things to happen, and then say, how do we learn from that and prevent that from happening in our profession? Which brings us back to our technique, the things we do. We model data. We do analysis. We look for commonalities and overlaps in data sets, and there are things we can do. But ultimately, we have to bear in mind, we have to really focus on the fact that data is about people. And as long as we reframe that focus, that data isn't just this abstract thing, but that everything we do with data is either triggered by a person, is done by a person, or results in a decision or an outcome that may affect a person, then that personalizes things for us, and we are possibly less likely to do unethical things. Like the classic Dilbert cartoon where Catbert is consulting and they want to sell the customer data. And his recommendation is, well, the first thing we do is we don't call them customers, we just refer to them as data. And it gets easier from there because we depersonalize it. We need to repersonalize this profession and remember why we're doing what we do.
And I think in your book, you actually refer to an ethical impact assessment, very similar to that of a PIA. You introduced that EIA in the same way of safeguards that are put in place to prevent this thing from happening.
Exactly. And that's just a way of thinking about these issues. It's not even a definitive prescriptive tool. Ultimately, what we need to just have mechanisms where we say, hang on a second, what might go wrong here? What aren't we thinking about? And one of the things I would suggest is getting more women and minorities involved. One thing, when I look at areas and instances where there have been ethical issues arising in data, it's usually because it's been people of a certain complexion and a certain gender, usually middle class, with less life experience of what might go wrong. And that's where diversity and inclusion strategies in our profession are really, really important to get those different perspectives on what might the negatives be here in our proposed processing. What group of people aren't we thinking about who might be affected by our proposed activities?
Okay, so Kira asked the question, different audiences would naturally interpret information differently. And this is almost in presentation or visualization of data. When presenting data, is it still unethical to present data differently so that it results in the same information if it was purely to compensate for the various interpretations?
I think it's unethical if you're changing the meaning and if you're changing the outcome. If the change in presentation is simply to improve the communication, that's fine. You're imparting knowledge there. So the ethical question is it okay to change the way we're presenting this information because different audiences process that information in different ways? And in some cases, you might have to present it in different ways. If you're dealing with an audience that has people in it who are neurodivergent, who mightn't process visual data well, but might process numerical data fantastically well, or vice versa. You would want to be choosing the appropriate way to communicate the information. What makes it unethical is if you are taking a negative thing and coloring it green, which suggests that it's good, because that's short-circuiting the heuristics that people might have in their brain. Also, if you're picking red and green, just remember that 23% of European men are colorblind and might have difficulty seeing those colors. I speak from experience.
Veronica too. Then we've gone through that now. Obi, Ubapeng, you got your hand up, and I know Drew as well, but I can't see him anymore. Obi?
Oh, hi, good afternoon, Howard and everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for bringing such a great presentation of the speaker. I really appreciate it. I must say I joined towards the tail end of the presentation, and some of the points that I just want to make might have been covered already, but I'm happy to go through the recording as well. This topic is very interesting for me specifically because I'm also doing a bit of research around it for my studies. So I just want to find out, you've mentioned things around the book. I just want to know, can you share a little bit more details on how one can access it? Do you have maybe electronic version of it? I think that will help. And then the other question is more around, is there any specific use case where this, like the implementation, especially around data management controls, where you can talk about more practical application of controls being embedded, being implemented in an organization, if maybe you can share with us around that as well. And just maybe a last comment, because I've been trying to also get more information around this topic as it's fairly new. Even from organization perspective, we've been trying to put together, understand the impact of things like your Microsoft Copilot, how far it goes in terms of, accessing organizations' data when you try to take it and maybe even customize it to use it or utilize it for things like maybe your data management queries or as a chatbot. How far does it go in terms of accessing the data internally and the security or the risk around it? So that's basically my comment. And lastly, I mean, I know even in the country, our Department of Communication and Digital Technology, they have published a discussion document around the AI policy, which I've been trying to review and unpack. If maybe there's any other material out there that you can share, I think I will really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, in terms of other material out there, I did work for the United Nations developing the AI regulatory framework for Ghana. So that's a good starting point because it looks at the interplay between principles, practices, and the role of legislation. In terms of mapping out a multi-year framework rollout for a regulatory environment in Ghana. In terms of the book, koganpage.com is where the book can be found. You can also get it on Amazon if you really want to give money to Jeff Bezos. He doesn't need it. But Kogan Page have it, and you might get lucky and you might win a copy of the book. Who knows? The question around controls, from an ethics perspective, part of your controls and safeguards and implementation is kind of organizational procedural checks and balances where you're checking to make sure people have thought of things, and how you integrate that into your standard data governance processes is key. But also how you define automated controls can also have potentially an ethical question to it in terms of what you measure and how you measure it. Because you may be tempted, for example, if you're doing workplace monitoring, if you're monitoring staff, for example, you might be tempted to track everything they do in the office environment based on what you can get off their in terms of logs and telemetry from their devices. But there may be an ethical question of, well, do you need to know where they were when they did the action, or do you need to monitor all of their actions all of the time? Or are you going to trust your staff that when they log in, you'll measure them based on the outputs they're producing rather than the inputs they're adding? And personally, I'd much rather people measure outputs than inputs because, well, it's easier. You can say, hey, there's that thing you delivered, and you delivered it on time, versus your Microsoft Teams indicator said you were away from your desk. Well, that's the approach my wife's employer took to measuring their performance and productivity in the workplace, was were they on green. I bought her a thing on Amazon that just jiggled her mouse, and she was always on green. Very easy to game that system. Not as easy to game, did you produce the report you had to produce on Friday? Did you produce it on Friday? So that's the key thing in terms of designing controls. It's about thinking about the data, thinking about the objective of your control, and then picking the appropriate level of invasiveness, because any control, any metric is going to be invasive in some way. But whether you do that as a preventative invasiveness, where you may be perceived as slowing down the race to do something on a project because you're asking someone to stop and fill out an ethical impact assessment to think about, well, is there a better way of doing this? Or have they considered the issues and risks? Or are you doing it with an automated technical control that might be tracking things that you shouldn't be tracking, or might be tracking more than you need to track? Things like that are key. And in terms of how Microsoft Copilot works, please read Microsoft's technical documentation for Copilot. It explicitly says, if you have not implemented appropriate metadata management, appropriate access control management, and appropriate document and content management in your SharePoint environment, basically Microsoft isn't responsible for the bad things that happen. Copilot and large language models sit on top of your existing information management. They do not replace it. Also, a large language model is not a tool for querying a database. It is a really inefficient way of writing an SQL query. My personal view on large language models, on Microsoft Copilot in particular, is that 80% of the value organizations are going to get from implementing them is going to come from the preparatory work doing the fundamentals of data and records management that are necessary to implement those tools effectively. Otherwise, they are going to be just another layer of technology that everyone says in 6 months' time, that didn't work, that project was a waste of time. I'm old, I've seen this happen before. A friend of mine in one of the UK local government agencies that has implemented their Microsoft partner, so they were one of the lead implementers of Copilot in local government in the UK. he described it as being all of the technical debt they had coming due in one go and having to be paid in 6 months in order to make their Copilot implementation work.
And Obi, just to share, in Daragh's first book, he explained how data models were used to connect data around census information in Ireland. And that was it was nice to read, but what I recognized that I had to institute in a self-service policies and procedures, we had to almost look at curating what the people were joining, what data sets they were joining. And the only way you could really do this was using a data model that you could then see what was happening between those different data sets and what they could discover with the joining. Okay, so that was a great example that I got from just recognizing the skills and the data management principles that can be applied in this situation.
I think what we're going to see over the next few years is that the fundamentals and the technique, the craft we have as data management professionals, the way we apply it is going to change because of AI and large language models. But the need to apply it is going to be even more important.
Yeah. One last question from Kyla. Regarding your comment on minority groups, I've recently had a conversation about how certain statistical models used within certain industries underlying end up discriminating against minority groups simply because of the statistics and data. Think insurance companies and people of certain age and gender. Should these companies be accountable to these underlying discriminations? This could certainly impact their entire business model.
Well, so in Europe, they are.
Yeah.
And yes, it will impact their business model. But if your business model is built on an incomplete understanding of the data and a data model that doesn't accurately reflect the reality of the environment you're operating in, your business model is actually inherently potentially flawed as well. It may be that by more accurately reflecting different minority groups, and not discriminating against them, but recognizing them, you may find new opportunities in the data for your organization and for the business model. And that's one of the key evolutions that organizations probably need to embrace, is that there may be potential gold in them there hills in the areas they may have been ignoring. But I still find it somewhat confusing that in the Irish insurance industry, my insurance premium is lower if I have my wife as a named driver on my insurance policy, even though she doesn't sit in my car, she's never with me when I'm driving, simply because apparently she's a moderating influence. All I'll say is the model has never whoever came up with that model has never sat in the car while my wife has been commenting on the direction of travel and the speed of travel. Very distracting. She means well. She means well.
Okay, so I asked a whole lot of questions, and I'm not sure if everyone got the answer they were looking for. So just before we ask Daragh to make a judgment, an ethical judgment on who wins the book, is there anyone that has any further questions for Daragh just before we bring it to an end? Kyla, just checking all your comments answered. Praveen, anyone with any outstanding questions? If you can put your hand up, that would be great. Okay, it seems like you did a great job. Everyone was comfortable, happy with the answers. Fantastic. So Daragh, last one on you. Who do you feel, and you may just remember the question and I'll find the person.
Okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. Kyle's question was a really interesting one because it highlights the importance of how data affects people, irrespective of the nature of the data. It was a really good question. So I think you have a physical copy of the book at the moment, Howard, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. And Obe's question was also interesting, and he wanted an electronic copy of the book. So Castlebridge will sponsor an electronic copy of the book, so I don't have to choose between two good questions.
Okay, fantastic. Now, Daragh, we didn't get it right with Kogan. That was with Tom Redman's book to get you to sign it. So that's always nice when we can get the author to sign the book, and hopefully on LinkedIn they'll share it with us. Do you know of any technique that we could use to get you to sign the book?
It all depends on how patient people might want to be, because there may be a way of just me signing a copy and sending it to you.
Okay. Yeah, we were able to just get the digital signature, but that's probably not going to work with Kogan Pen. All right.
Yeah, that would involve a special print run being done, unfortunately.
Okay. So let me talk. I'll talk to you and Kyla. I'll see whether we can get a physical book sorted out with Daragh. And Obi, what I'll do as well is I'll just send an email to you, Daragh, with the different names and emails, and we'll sort out the prizes. Thank you very much, Daragh. Really appreciate your time. It's always great to hear your insights. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Daragh. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Bye.